Kansas wind never stopped. It rolled across the prairie in endless waves, bending the tall grass into patterns that looked like the surface of a green ocean. Emma Sullivan had learned to read that wind the way sailors read water, understanding when it carried rain, when it promised storms, and when it simply spoke of the emptiness that stretched from horizon to horizon. 12 years old and small for her age, Emma stood at the edge of her uncle's property, watching dark clouds gather in the western sky. Her calico dress, faded from too many washings, whipped around her thin legs. Her blonde hair, braided tightly to keep it manageable, had already come partially loose in the persistent breeze. She held a wooden bucket in one hand and a walking stick in the other, tools for the daily journey to fetch water from the creek that ran along the settlement's southern boundary. Emma had been living with her Uncle Jeremiah and Aunt Catherine for 8 months, ever since cholera had taken her parents during the wagon journey from Missouri. The Sullivans had welcomed her into their small, soddy home carved into a hillside, but it was clear they struggled to feed themselves, let alone an extra mouth. Uncle Jeremiah worked from sunrise to sunset, trying to coax crops from the stubborn prairie soil, while Aunt Catherine managed the endless domestic tasks that kept frontier families alive. The settlement of Prairie Bend consisted of maybe 40 families scattered across several miles of grassland, with a small cluster of buildings that optimistically called itself a town center. There was a general store run by the Hoffmans, a blacksmith shop where old Samuel worked, a one-room schoolhouse that doubled as a church on Sundays, and a rough building that served as both meeting hall and, when necessary, a jail. Emma walked toward town with her bucket, following the well-worn path through grass that reached past her waist in places. The sky continued darkening, and she quickened her pace, hoping to complete her errands before the rain arrived. Prairie storms could be fierce and dangerous, appearing with little warning and turning the landscape into a treacherous, muddy expanse. As she approached the town center, Emma noticed unusual activity. A crowd had gathered near the makeshift jail, and she could hear raised voices carrying across the open space. Curiosity overcame her natural shyness, and she moved closer to see what was happening. Sheriff Dalton stood in front of the jail building, a rough structure made of thick timbers with a heavy door and barred window. He was addressing the assembled townspeople, most of whom were men, though a few women stood at the edges of the gathering. Emma recognized most of them: farmers, the blacksmith, the store owner, a few ranch hands from the larger properties to the north. The sheriff was explaining that Army Scouts had captured a Cheyenne warrior 3 days ago, about 20 miles west of the settlement. The man had been badly wounded, shot during what the Scouts claimed was a raid on a supply wagon. Unable to travel with their wounded prisoner, and unwilling to simply execute him without proper authority, the Scouts had brought him to Prairie Bend's jail to await the circuit judge, who was expected in 2 weeks. Emma moved to where she could see through the crowd. The jail's barred window was visible, and through it she caught a glimpse of the prisoner. He sat on the dirt floor, his back against the wall, his head tilted forward. Even from this distance, Emma could see dark stains on his clothing that suggested significant blood loss. His hands were shackled, and he appeared barely conscious. A rancher named Thornton was speaking loudly, arguing that keeping the warrior here was dangerous. He claimed that Cheyenne warriors never traveled alone, that this man's companions would come looking for him, and that the settlement would become a target. Several others voiced agreement, their fear evident in harsh tones and aggressive postures. Sheriff Dalton held up his hands, calling for calm. He explained that he had orders from the territorial authorities to hold the prisoner for proper legal proceedings. Simply executing him or releasing him would bring its own set of problems with the army and territorial government. The man was secured, the sheriff insisted, and posed no immediate threat. A woman Emma didn't recognize well spoke up, asking about the prisoner's wounds and whether a doctor had examined him. The sheriff's uncomfortable expression provided the answer, before his words did. The nearest doctor was in Abilene, 2 days away by fast horse. Given the prisoner's status, no one had seen fit to make that journey. Emma felt something tighten in her chest as she looked at the figure in the jail cell. She thought about her own parents, how they had died slowly from illness, while others on the wagon train had been too afraid of contagion to help. She remembered the thirst, the pain, the way her father had whispered for water in his final hours. The memory made her throat constrict. The crowd began to disperse as the first drops of rain started falling. People hurried toward shelter, pulling coats tighter and quickening their steps. Emma stood rooted in place, rain beginning to soak through her thin dress, staring at that barred window and the barely visible figure beyond it. She knew what the adults were thinking without them saying it directly. If the prisoner died from his wounds before the judge arrived, it would solve several problems. No trial, no possibility of his tribe attempting a rescue, no awkward questions about treatment of prisoners. They would simply bury him in an unmarked grave and file a report stating he had died from injuries sustained during his capture. Emma understood the fear that drove such thinking. Life on the prairie was precarious enough, without adding conflicts with the native tribes whose lands settlers had claimed. There had been incidents, attacks on isolated homesteads, stolen livestock, violent encounters between army patrols and warrior bands. Everyone carried stories or knew someone who had suffered loss. But Emma also knew something else. She knew what it felt like to watch someone die slowly, while others turned away. She knew the desperate thirst that came with fever and blood loss. She knew that underneath all the fear and justifications, they were talking about letting a human being die because it was convenient. The rain intensified, driving most people indoors. Emma finally moved, but instead of heading home, she walked slowly past the jail. Through the bars, she could see the prisoner more clearly now. He was young, perhaps in his 20s, with long dark hair plastered to his face by rain coming through gaps in the rough roof. His breathing was shallow and labored. His eyes were closed, and he had slumped further down the wall. Emma completed her water-fetching errand mechanically, her mind churning with thoughts she couldn't quite articulate. As she walked back toward her uncle's homestead through the driving rain, she made a decision that terrified and compelled her in equal measure. She would help him. Somehow, despite the laws and consequences, despite her own fear and uncertainty, she would find a way to give that dying man water and food. That evening, after helping Aunt Catherine prepare dinner and completing her chores, Emma lay on her pallet in the corner of the Soddy's single room, listening to her aunt and uncle's quiet conversation. They spoke about the prisoner, about the tension in the settlement, about their hope that the situation would resolve itself quickly. Emma waited until their breathing deepened into sleep. The rain had stopped, leaving the prairie air fresh and cool. Carefully, moving with practiced silence, she gathered items she would need. A small cloth bag she filled with leftover cornbread, a tin cup, her own blanket, thin but better than nothing. The Soddy door opened with barely a creak. Emma stepped into the night, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might wake her aunt and uncle. The moon was partially obscured by lingering clouds, providing just enough light to navigate by. She knew every step of the path to town, had walked it countless times. But tonight, each familiar landmark seemed strange and threatening. Prairie Bend was silent, its few buildings dark shapes against the slightly lighter sky. Emma moved like a ghost through the grass, approaching the jail from the side where she'd be less visible from the general store and blacksmith shop. The jail window faced away from the main street, a small mercy. She stood outside the barred opening, her hands shaking as she reached into her bag. Through the bars, she could see the prisoner still slumped in the same position. For a terrifying moment, she thought he might already be dead, but then she saw his chest rise and fall with shallow breaths. Emma whispered softly, unsure if he could understand English, unsure if he was even conscious enough to respond. She held the cup of water she'd carried carefully from home up to the bars, extending it as far as her small arm could reach into the cell. Nothing happened for several long seconds. Then slowly the prisoner's head lifted. His eyes opened, dark and clouded with pain and fever. He looked at Emma at the cup of water she held, and confusion crossed his features. He made no move toward her offering, and Emma realized he probably thought she was an hallucination or some kind of trap. She set the cup on the narrow sill of the barred window, pushed the bread through the bars so it fell on the floor near him, and carefully draped her blanket so part of it hung inside the cell. Then she stepped back, showing her empty hands, making herself visible in the moonlight so he could see she was just a child, alone and unarmed. Emma spoke quietly, not sure if he understood her words, but hoping her tone conveyed intent. She told him she'd brought food and water. She said she was sorry he was hurt. She promised she'd come back tomorrow night if she could. The warrior stared at her, his expression unreadable. Slowly, painfully, He reached for the cup of water. His shackled hands made the movement awkward, but he managed to bring it to his lips. He drank carefully, and Emma saw his eyes close briefly in what might have been relief or gratitude. When he finished, he looked at her again. Their eyes met through the bars, and something passed between them that needed no language. He gave a slight nod, barely perceptible, but Emma understood it as acknowledgement. He had seen her act of mercy, had accepted it, and something in that exchange felt profoundly important. Emma turned and fled back into the prairie darkness, her heart still racing, but now from exhilaration as much as fear. She had done something that could bring severe punishment if discovered. She had broken laws and social codes that governed frontier life. But as she slipped back into the soddy and onto her pallet, pulling her remaining thin blanket around herself, she felt something she hadn't experienced in the long months since her parents' death. She felt like herself again, like someone who acted according to conscience rather than convenience, like someone her parents would have recognized and been proud of. The risk was enormous, but the alternative, doing nothing while someone died within her power to help, was unbearable. As Emma drifted towards sleep, she didn't know that her small act of defiance had been witnessed. She didn't know that young Billy Hoffman, unable to sleep and wandering the settlement, had seen a small figure approach the jail and linger by the window. She didn't know that Billy, 12 years old like herself, and wrestling with his own confusion about right and wrong, would keep her secret for now, but would struggle with what to do about what he'd seen, and Emma certainly didn't know that the warrior she'd helped, whose name was Tallgrass and who came from a Cheyenne band camped along the Republican River, had already been missed. His brother and fellow warriors were searching for him, following trails and asking questions. When they learned where he was and what had happened, they would make decisions that would test every person in Prairie Bend and transform Emma's small act of compassion into something far larger than she could have imagined. But for now, in the quiet darkness of the Kansas night, with the wind whispering through the grass and stars emerging from behind departing clouds, Emma slept more soundly than she had in months. She had chosen kindness over fear. Whatever came next, that choice was hers, and she would face the consequences with the same determination that had carried her through loss and hardship. Tomorrow, she would return to the jail. She would bring more food and water. She would continue her secret mercy until either the judge arrived or the prisoner healed enough to face whatever justice awaited him. It was a small thing, really, in the vast, indifferent prairie. But sometimes small things carried weight beyond their size. Sometimes a cup of water offered in darkness could change the course of rivers yet to flow. Dawn came to the Kansas prairie with its usual subtle beauty, the eastern sky gradually shifting from deep purple to pink to pale gold. Emma woke to the sound of her aunt moving around the soddy, preparing the morning meal. For a moment she felt disoriented. Then memory flooded back, the jail, the prisoner, the water and food she'd smuggled to him in darkness. She touched her palate and realized with a start that she'd given away her blanket. The night had been cool but not cold, and she'd managed without it. But its absence would be noticed. Emma's mind raced as she tried to think of an explanation that wouldn't raise suspicion. Aunt Catherine called her to help with breakfast, and Emma rose quickly, braiding her hair and straightening her dress. As they worked together, preparing cornmeal mush and the last of their bacon, Catherine asked casually if Emma had been warm enough during the night. The question felt weighted with more than surface concern. Emma answered carefully that she'd been fine, though she wondered where her blanket had gotten to. She suggested maybe it had fallen behind the pallet or been moved somehow. It was a thin lie, and she hated lying to her aunt who had taken her in when she had nowhere else to go. But the alternative, admitting what she'd done, would bring consequences Emma wasn't ready to face. Catherine looked at her niece with an expression Emma couldn't quite read, then simply nodded and returned to cooking. The subject was dropped, but Emma felt the weight of that unspoken question hanging in the air like smoke. After breakfast, Uncle Jeremiah headed to the fields, and Emma began her daily chores. She fed the chickens, gathered eggs, helped Catherine with washing, and prepared vegetables for the midday meal. All the while her mind kept returning to the jail and wondering if the warrior was still alive, if her small offerings had provided any real relief. Around mid-morning, Catherine sent Emma to the general store to trade eggs for sugar and flour. The Hoffman store was the social center of Prairie Bend, where news and gossip flowed as freely as the goods that crossed the counter. Emma approached with her usual quiet demeanor, hoping to complete the transaction quickly and avoid attention. But the store was buzzing with conversation when she entered. Several men stood near the counter, including Sheriff Dalton and Marcus Thornton, the rancher who'd been most vocal about the prisoner yesterday. Emma tried to make herself small and invisible as she approached Mrs. Hoffman with her basket of eggs. The conversation was about the prisoner, of course. Sheriff Dalton was explaining that he'd checked on the man that morning and found evidence that someone had brought him food and water. A tin cup that didn't belong to the jail sat near the bars. Crumbs of cornbread littered the floor. And most puzzling, a blanket, definitely not jail property, had been draped partially into the cell. The sheriff's tone was more curious than angry, but the implications were clear. Someone had violated both law and common sense by aiding the prisoner. The question was who and why. Thornton's voice rose above the others, declaring that whoever had done this was a traitor to the settlement, potentially endangering everyone by showing mercy to an enemy. Others murmured agreement, though some voices sounded less certain, as if struggling with the moral complexity of the situation. Emma felt her face flush and kept her eyes fixed on the counter as Mrs. Hoffman examined the eggs and calculated their trade value. She was acutely aware of every sound in the store, every shift in conversation. She waited for someone to point at her, to accuse her, to drag her before the assembled men and demand explanations. But then a different voice spoke up. The young Billy Hoffman emerged from the back room where he'd been sorting inventory. He looked directly at Emma for just a moment, and she saw something in his eyes, a question, a decision being made in real time. Then Billy turned to his father and the assembled men. He told them he'd been unable to sleep the previous night and had wandered near the jail. He'd seen someone approach it, but in the darkness and rain he couldn't make out who it was. The figure had been small, possibly a woman or youth, but had moved quickly and been gone before Billy could get closer. He'd assumed it was someone checking on the prisoner's condition, perhaps even the sheriff himself. It was a half-truth that protected Emma while providing information. Billy met Emma's eyes again briefly, and she understood he had made a choice to shield her secret, while acknowledging something had happened. She also understood that this protection wouldn't last forever, that Billy was buying her time rather than permanently covering for her actions. The conversation in the store shifted to speculation about who might have helped the prisoner. Some suggested it could have been a sympathizer from another settlement. Others wondered if it was someone with family connections to native tribes. The focus moved away from determining identity to debating whether the act had been foolish compassion or deliberate sabotage. Emma completed her transaction and left the store as quickly as politeness allowed. Outside, the morning sun had burned away the clouds, leaving the prairie bright and exposed. She felt exposed too, as if her secret was written across her face for anyone observant enough to read. As she walked back toward her uncle's homestead, Emma heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Billy Hoffman jogging to catch up. They'd known each other casually. The settlement was too small for children not to know each other, but had never been particularly close friends. Billy fell into step beside her, his hands shoved in his pockets, his expression serious beyond his 12 years. For several minutes they walked in silence, the tall grass brushing against their legs and the wind carrying the distant calls of prairie birds. Finally, Billy spoke, his voice low even though no one was around to overhear. He asked Emma directly if she'd been the one at the jail last night. Emma hesitated, weighing the risks of admission against the relief of having someone know the truth. Something in Billy's face, an openness, a lack of judgment, made her nod slowly. Billy absorbed this confirmation, then asked why. It was a simple question, but Emma struggled to articulate the complex mixture of memory, conscience, and stubborn compassion that had driven her actions. She finally said that she'd watched her parents die slowly, while others turned away out of fear, and she couldn't do the same thing to someone else, even if that someone was supposed to be an enemy. Billy nodded thoughtfully. He told Emma that his father had fought in the war back east, had been wounded and left for dead on a battlefield. A Confederate soldier, technically an enemy, had given his father water and helped him to safety. His father rarely spoke of it, but Billy knew the story. He said he understood why Emma had done what she did, even if it was dangerous and illegal. But Billy also warned Emma that she couldn't keep it up. Too many people were watching now. The sheriff would increase his vigilance. If Emma was caught, the consequences would be severe, possibly jail time for her, certainly loss of her home with the Sullivans, maybe even worse depending on how the territorial authorities chose to respond. Emma knew Billy was right, but she also knew she couldn't simply stop. The warrior was still wounded, still dying without proper care. One night of food and water wasn't enough. She asked Billy if he would help her, immediately regretting the question even as it left her lips. It was unfair to drag him into her trouble, but Billy surprised her. After a long pause, he agreed to help, but with conditions. They would be smarter about it, more careful. Billy knew the routines of the settlement better than Emma did, knew when the sheriff made his rounds and when the jail area was least observed. He said his father had medical supplies left from the war, bandages, a jar of carbolic solution for cleaning wounds, even some laudanum for pain. If they were going to help the prisoner survive, they needed to do more than bring food and water. Over the next week, Emma and Billy developed a careful system. They never approached the jail together. Billy would scout first, ensuring the area was clear, then signal Emma with a bird call they'd agreed upon. Emma would bring food she'd carefully saved from her own portions, cornbread, jerky, preserved fruit when available. Billy brought medical supplies and, eventually, tools to pick the lock on the prisoner's shackles so he could move more freely and care for his wounds better. The warrior, who Emma learned was named Tall Grass, through halting attempts at communication, slowly began to recover. His wounds, properly cleaned and bandaged, showed signs of healing. The fever that had gripped him broke after 3 days. By the end of the week, he was able to stand and move around the small cell, though he was still weak from blood loss and poor conditions. Tall Grass began teaching Emma and Billy words in Cheyenne during their whispered nighttime visits. He told them about his life, his family, his people's struggles to maintain their way of life as settlers poured into territories that had been theirs for generations. He spoke without anger or blame, simply stating facts that Emma and Billy had never considered from that perspective. In turn, Emma told Tallgrass about losing her parents, about the fear and uncertainty of frontier life. Billy shared his own story, how his family had come west seeking opportunity, how his younger sister had died from scarlet fever their first winter, how survival took all their energy and left little room for understanding people different from themselves. These conversations, conducted in whispers through iron bars with a mixture of English, Cheyenne, and gestures, created an unlikely bond. 3 young people, 2 white frontier children and a Cheyenne warrior, found common ground in their shared humanity. Their losses, their hopes for futures that seemed uncertain at best, but their secret couldn't last forever. On the 8th night after Emma's first visit to the jail, everything changed. She and Billy were with Tallgrass, Emma passing food through the bars while Billy checked the bandages on the warrior's side wound. When they heard horses approaching the settlement, it was late, well past midnight, and the sound of multiple horses moving quickly was alarming. Tallgrass's entire body tensed, his head cocking toward the sound. He said something in Cheyenne that Emma and Billy didn't understand, but his tone communicated urgency. The children fled from the jail, but instead of heading home, they moved to where they could see what was happening. What they saw made Emma's blood run cold. At least 20 riders were approaching Prairie Bend from the west, moving in a coordinated line. Even in the moonlight, their silhouettes were distinctive, warriors on horseback, carrying weapons, riding with purpose. Billy grabbed Emma's arm, pulling her toward the general store where they could alert his parents. Within minutes, the entire settlement was awake, people emerging from homes with rifles and lanterns, the church bell ringing an alarm that carried across the prairie. Sheriff Dalton organized the men into defensive positions while sending someone to fire a signal gun that might summon help from neighboring settlements or army patrols. Women and children were directed to the most secure buildings. Emma found herself pushed into the Hoffman store basement with a dozen other terrified children and their mothers. But the expected attack never came. The riders stopped well outside rifle range, a clear sign they hadn't come for immediate combat. They formed a line and simply waited as dawn began to break. As light gradually illuminated the scene, Emma could see them more clearly. Cheyenne warriors, yes, but not in war formation. Several held up long poles with white cloth attached, flags of truce. Sheriff Dalton and several other men cautiously approached the line of warriors, staying within shouting distance, but not so close that they couldn't retreat if needed. A single rider moved forward from the Cheyenne group, a man who appeared to be of high rank or authority based on the deference others showed him. Emma had snuck to a window where she could see and hear parts of the exchange. The Cheyenne leader spoke in heavily accented but understandable English. He stated his name was Running Wolf, and he had come for his brother, the warrior being held in the settlement's jail. He knew his brother was wounded and imprisoned. He knew the settlement feared retaliation. He had not come to fight but to negotiate. Running Wolf made an unprecedented offer. If the settlement would release Tallgrass into his care, he would bring 20 horses as payment, compensation for the perceived crimes his brother was accused of, and guarantee of good faith. Additionally, he would ensure that his band would avoid this area, would not raid or threaten these settlers. He spoke of wanting peace, of understanding that his people and the settlers would have to find ways to coexist because neither was leaving these lands. The offer stunned the assembled men. It was generous beyond expectation, suggesting either that Tallgrass held significant importance to his people or that Running Wolf saw some larger strategic value in this gesture of peace. But it also put the settlement in an impossible position. The prisoner was being held under territorial authority for trial. Releasing him, even with compensation, would be viewed by the government as capitulation or collaboration with hostiles. As the men debated how to respond, Tallgrass's voice rang out from the jail. He called to his brother in Cheyenne, a conversation that carried across the morning air. Emma couldn't understand the words, but she heard the emotion. Relief, urgency, and something else. Tallgrass was telling his brother something important. Then, to everyone's shock, Tallgrass called out in English. He asked Sheriff Dalton to let him address both his brother and the settlers. The sheriff, seeing no harm in it, agreed. What Tallgrass said next would change everything. The warrior told his brother about 2 children who had risked everything to help him when no one else would. He explained how a small girl with hair like sunset and a boy who moved like a fox had brought him food, water, medicine, and hope. He said these children had seen him not as an enemy, but as a human being in need, and that such courage and compassion should be honored, not punished. Tallgrass then spoke to the settlers. He told them they had no idea what treasures they had in their midst, that children who acted with such integrity would grow into adults of great character. He said that his people would remember what these 2 had done, that the names Emma Sullivan and Billy Hoffman would be spoken with respect around Cheyenne fires. The silence that followed was profound. Every eye turned toward the Hoffman store, where Emma stood frozen at the window. Billy had moved beside her, his face pale but his shoulders straight. They had been exposed, their secret revealed to everyone. The reactions came quickly, shock from their families, anger from those who saw their actions as betrayal, confusion from those trying to reconcile what they'd heard with what they believed about right and wrong. But before the chaos could fully erupt, Running Wolf spoke again. He announced that his offer had changed. He would still bring the 20 horses, but now he had an additional request. He wanted to thank the 2 children personally for what they had done for his brother. He asked that Emma and Billy be allowed to come forward, under flag of truce, to receive gifts and recognition from the Cheyenne people. This request created a new kind of tension. Allowing the children to approach the warriors carried risk, though the white flag suggested peaceful intent. But refusing might insult Running Wolf and destroy whatever chance for peaceful resolution this situation offered. The settlement's leaders looked at each other, at the children, at the line of mounted warriors, and struggled with a decision that seemed impossible. Emma made it for them. Before anyone could stop her, she pushed past the adults and walked out of the store toward the line of Cheyenne warriors. Her heart pounded so hard she thought she might faint, but she kept walking, kept her head high, kept moving forward despite her fear. Billy emerged seconds later, running to catch up with Emma. Together, the 2 12-year-olds walked across the open space between the settlement and the warriors, exposed and vulnerable, betting everything on the honor of people they'd been taught to fear. As they drew closer to the line of horses, Emma could see the faces of the warriors more clearly. She saw surprise, respect, and something else, approval, as if they recognized the courage required to make this walk. Running Wolf dismounted and approached them, stopping at a respectful distance. He looked at Emma and Billy for a long moment, then spoke in careful English. He thanked them for their mercy toward his brother. He said that true warriors recognized bravery in all its forms, and what these children had done required a courage that many adults never achieved. He said his people would remember them as friends. Then Running Wolf did something unexpected. He called forward several more riders, and Emma saw that some of them were women and children. Families, not just warriors. They brought gifts: beautifully beaded moccasins, woven blankets, a small leather pouch containing polished stones and feathers. These were not random trade goods, but personal items, things that carried meaning and value. As Emma and Billy accepted these gifts with trembling hands, more riders appeared on the horizon. But these were not Cheyenne. They were settlers, homesteaders from neighboring areas who had seen the signal fires and come expecting to join a fight. What they found instead was something none of them had imagined possible. They found two children standing between two worlds, holding gifts from people they'd been taught to fear, having built a bridge across a divide that seemed impossible to cross. And as the morning sun climbed higher over the Kansas prairie, illuminating this unprecedented gathering, everyone present understood they were witnessing something rare and precious. They were witnessing what courage looked like when it chose compassion over convenience, understanding over hatred, and hope over fear. And though the larger conflicts between settlers and native peoples would continue for many years, though peace remained elusive and suffering on both sides would persist in that moment, on that prairie, two children had proven that individual choices still mattered, that even in times of great division, human decency could still find a way to bridge the unbridgeable. The standoff on the Kansas prairie continued as the morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the assembled groups. More settlers from neighboring homesteads arrived, expecting conflict but finding instead an intense tableau of negotiation. Emma and Billy stood between the two worlds, literally positioned between the line of Cheyenne warriors and the cluster of armed settlers holding the gifts Running Wolf had presented them. Sheriff Dalton called for Emma and Billy to return to the settlement side, his voice carrying both authority and concern. But before they could move, Running Wolf spoke again, his words directed toward the sheriff, but meant for everyone assembled. He explained that the situation before them was unprecedented, requiring wisdom beyond the usual responses of fear or force. His brother Tallgrass had been wounded, fighting what he believed was a legitimate battle over hunting territories that had been promised to the Cheyenne by treaty, then violated by settlers and the army. Running Wolf did not claim his brother was innocent of the charges against him, but he argued that context mattered, that survival drove actions on all sides. More importantly, Running Wolf said, his brother had been shown mercy by two children who owed him nothing and risked much to offer it. This act created an obligation, a debt that Cheyenne honor required be acknowledged and repaid. The horses he offered were not payment for his brother's freedom, but gratitude for his brother's life being sustained when it could have been allowed to extinguish. Marcus Thornton, the rancher, who had been most vocal about the threat the prisoner posed, shouted from the settler side that mercy shown to an enemy was foolishness that could get them all attacked. He pointed to past incidents: homesteads burned, cattle stolen, people injured or driven from their claims. How could they trust any promise of peace from people who had attacked them before? Running Wolf turned his gaze toward Thornton, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of profound weariness. He asked if Thornton's people had never attacked first, never broken promises, never taken what wasn't theirs. He spoke of villages destroyed by the army, of children sick and starving on reservations where promised supplies never arrived, of sacred lands violated by miners and settlers who saw only resources to exploit. He wasn't making excuses, Running Wolf said, but demanding acknowledgement that violence and broken trust existed on both sides of this conflict. If they waited for perfect innocence before showing mercy, if they required absolute certainty before risking peace, then the cycle would never end. Somebody had to be brave enough to take the first step towards something different. Emma found her voice then, surprising herself as much as anyone. She spoke loudly enough to be heard by both groups, her young voice carrying across the prairie with unexpected strength. She said that she hadn't helped the prisoner because she thought he was innocent or because she expected anything in return. She helped him because he was suffering and she could do something about it, and that seemed like enough of a reason. Billy added his agreement, his voice steadier than Emma's but equally determined. He said that his father had been shown mercy by an enemy soldier, and that act of compassion had allowed his father to survive and build a life here. If mercy was only extended when convenient or safe, then it wasn't really mercy, it was just another form of self-interest. The words of the two children hung in the morning air, challenging adults on both sides to consider perspectives they'd been avoiding. Uncle Jeremiah pushed through the crowd, his face a mixture of pride, concern, and confusion. He called to Emma, asking her to come back, but his tone was pleading rather than commanding. Aunt Catherine stood beside her husband, tears streaming down her face. She had taken in an orphaned niece out of duty and grown to love her fiercely. Now that child was standing in potential danger, exposed between armed groups, all because of a conscience that Catherine simultaneously feared and admired. The moment of decision had arrived. Sheriff Dalton had to choose whether to release Tallgrass or refuse Running Wolf's offer and attempt to hold the prisoner until the territorial authorities could establish jurisdiction. The Cheyenne leader would have to decide whether to accept whatever decision the settlers made or resort to force to rescue his brother. And the assembled settlers would have to choose between their fear and the possibility that two children had opened a door to something different. Tallgrass, still weak but able to stand, called out from the jail. He addressed his brother in Cheyenne, their conversation rapid and intense. Running Wolf's expression shifted from determination to surprise to what might have been respect. When Tallgrass finished speaking, Running Wolf turned back to the assembled settlers. He announced that his brother had made a choice that would surprise everyone. Tallgrass had decided to remain in custody, to face whatever justice the settlers' law demanded, on one condition, that Emma and Billy face no punishment for helping him. He would testify on their behalf, would take responsibility for accepting their aid, would ensure that all consequences fell on him rather than on the children who had shown him compassion. This declaration stunned both groups. Warriors shifted on their horses, clearly disagreeing with Tallgrass's decision to remain imprisoned. Settlers murmured in confusion, unable to understand why a warrior would choose captivity when his rescue was at hand. Only Emma and Billy seemed to grasp the profound gesture Tallgrass was making. He was protecting them, the way they had protected him, offering himself to shield them from consequences. Running Wolf spoke to his brother again, his tone urgent and questioning. Tallgrass responded firmly, his voice carrying conviction despite his weakened state. The exchange continued for several minutes, an argument conducted in Cheyenne but whose emotional content needed no translation. Finally, Running Wolf turned back to face Sheriff Dalton. He said that his brother had chosen honor over freedom, a path that their people respected, even when they disagreed with it. Running Wolf would accept Tallgrass's decision, but he made demands of his own. First, the warrior must receive proper medical care immediately, a doctor summoned from Abilene at Running Wolf's expense if necessary. Second, when the circuit judge arrived for trial, Running Wolf wanted permission to attend and speak on his brother's behalf. Third, any sentence imposed must be carried out with dignity, and Tallgrass must be allowed regular contact with his family. Sheriff Dalton looked overwhelmed by the unprecedented situation. He glanced at the assembled townspeople, seeing divided opinions written across their faces. Some wanted to refuse, to assert authority, and make no concessions to what they saw as demands from hostiles. Others recognized an opportunity that might never come again, a chance to demonstrate that their justice system could function fairly even when dealing with those they feared. The sheriff made his decision. He agreed to Running Wolf's terms with one addition of his own. The trial would be public, open to observers from both communities, conducted with full transparency, so all could witness that justice was being pursued rather than vengeance. He extended his hand toward Running Wolf in the gesture of agreement that frontier men used to seal bargains. Running Wolf studied the offered hand for a long moment. Around him, his warriors watched intently, waiting to follow whatever path their leader chose. Finally, Running Wolf dismounted completely and walked forward to clasp the sheriff's hand. The gesture was formal, weighted with significance that everyone present understood. It was not friendship, not yet trust, but it was acknowledgement, recognition that perhaps, just perhaps, there might be a way forward that didn't require constant bloodshed. The tension began to dissolve, though wariness remained on both sides. The Cheyenne warriors gradually relaxed their positions. Settlers lowered rifles that had been held ready for hours. Emma and Billy, still standing between the two groups, suddenly felt their legs go weak with the release of adrenaline that had kept them upright. Uncle Jeremiah rushed forward to gather Emma into his arms, holding her tightly while whispering that she was safe. She was foolish. She was brave. She was going to give him gray hair before his time. Aunt Catherine joined them, creating a small huddle of family in the midst of historic events. Billy was similarly embraced by his parents, his father's expression suggesting they would have a long conversation later. But for now, relief overwhelmed any other emotion. Running Wolf approached the children once more, this time accompanied by an older woman whose bearing suggested status within the tribe. She carried a leather bundle which she carefully unwrapped to reveal an intricately beaded vest, sized for a child. Through Running Wolf's translation, she explained that she was Tallgrass's mother, that she had spent the past 3 days creating this gift, and that it carried prayers of protection sewn into every bead. The woman placed the vest on Emma's shoulders, then did something that made every settler gasp. She pulled Emma into an embrace, holding the small girl who had saved her son's life. When she released Emma, there were tears on the older woman's weathered face. She spoke in Cheyenne, her voice thick with emotion, and Running Wolf translated, "You gave me back my son. I claim you as daughter. Whatever comes, you belong to our family." Now, a similar gift, a bow carved from strong wood and a quiver of arrows with white feathers, was presented to Billy, Running. Wolf explained that the white feathers marked them as peace arrows, to be used only for hunting, never for war. The gift acknowledged Billy's courage and his transition toward manhood, accomplished not through violence, but through choosing what was right over what was easy. As these exchanges unfolded, a rider appeared on the eastern horizon, approaching fast. He wore the uniform of an army courier, and his arrival brought fresh tension. The soldier delivered messages to Sheriff Dalton, orders from the Territorial Command, that a military detail would arrive within 3 days to transport the prisoner to a formal military tribunal, that the civilian authorities were being overruled in this matter, that the Cheyenne warrior would face army justice rather than civilian trial. The news threatened to unravel everything that had just been negotiated. Running Wolf's expression darkened, and his warriors immediately tensed. A military tribunal would be far less likely to consider context or show mercy. Army justice for captured warriors often meant swift, harsh punishment designed to deter others. The careful balance that had been achieved suddenly felt precarious, but Sheriff Dalton surprised everyone with his response. He informed the courier that he would acknowledge the orders but would not comply until the circuit judge arrived, as originally scheduled. He stated that Prairie Bend had extended protection to the prisoner, that negotiations had been made in good faith, and that breaking those agreements now would make the settlement's word worthless. He was willing to face consequences from the territorial authorities for his refusal. This defiance of military orders shocked the settlers as much as it impressed the Cheyenne. Several townspeople immediately protested, arguing that Dalton was risking federal intervention, possibly putting the entire settlement in jeopardy. But others spoke up in support, including, surprisingly, Marcus Thornton. The rancher said that whatever their fears about Indians, letting the army simply override civilian authority set a dangerous precedent. If they couldn't govern their own affairs, including difficult decisions about justice, then what was the point of building these communities? The debate raged through the afternoon as both groups remained assembled on the prairie. Food and water were brought from the settlement. The Cheyenne built small cooking fires and shared pemmican and dried meat. The surreal scene of two groups who had expected to fight instead, sharing space and sustenance, created its own kind of transformation. Emma and Billy found themselves at the center of continuing exchanges. Cheyenne children, initially brought by their parents as demonstration that this was a peaceful delegation, began cautiously approaching the two frontier children. Language barriers made communication difficult, but children have ways of connecting that transcend words. Games emerged, racing, target throwing, demonstrations of skills that earned mutual respect. Emma learned that one Cheyenne girl, slightly younger than herself, was Tallgrass's daughter. Through gesture and broken language, Emma understood that the girl had been terrified her father was dead, that finding him alive was like receiving a miracle. The two girls sat together, holding hands without speaking, sharing grief and relief that needed no translation. As evening approached, a compromise was reached. Tallgrass would remain in Prairie Ben's custody, but Running Wolf and a small group of his people would camp nearby, close enough to ensure their kinsman's safety, but far enough to avoid seeming threatening. When the circuit judge arrived, both civilian and military representatives could present their jurisdictional claims, and the judge would decide which authority took precedence. It wasn't perfect, but it gave everyone something. The settlers maintained nominal custody, the Cheyenne ensured their brothers' protection, and the army's orders were neither fully obeyed nor completely defied. Dr. Hendricks, though not expected until the following day, arrived that evening, having been summoned by multiple urgent messages. The weary physician examined Tallgrass by lamplight in the jail, with Running Wolf, Sheriff Dalton, and surprisingly, Emma and Billy all present. The doctor cleaned and properly dressed the wounds, administered medication for infection, and declared that with rest and care, the warrior should survive. Emma watched as Dr. Hendricks worked, seeing how he treated his patient with professional respect, regardless of the complex circumstances. When the doctor finished, he turned to Emma and asked her directly about the care she'd provided. She described what she'd done: the water, food, the attempts at wound cleaning with limited supplies. Dr. Hendricks nodded thoughtfully, then said something that would stay with Emma forever. He told her that she had saved this man's life, that her interventions had prevented infection from overwhelming him during those critical first days. He said that good medicine wasn't just about knowledge and tools. It was about recognizing that every life held value, and acting on that recognition even when doing so was difficult or dangerous. That night, as Emma lay on her pallet in the soddy, wearing the beaded vest that Tallgrass's mother had given her, she reflected on the extraordinary events of the past 2 weeks. She had acted on impulse and conscience, never imagining the chain of consequences that would follow. Her secret acts of mercy had been exposed, had brought 300 riders to the prairie, had created moments of crisis and connection that would reshape relationships in this part of Kansas. Uncle Jeremiah and Aunt Catherine had been remarkably restrained in their response to Emma's revelations. They were upset about the deception and frightened by the risks she'd taken, but they were also struggling with pride they felt uncomfortable admitting. Their orphaned niece had demonstrated a moral courage that challenged their own prejudices and assumptions. She had forced them to confront questions they'd been avoiding about humanity, justice, and what it meant to live according to principles they claimed to value. The trial, when it finally occurred 3 days later, became a landmark event in the territory's history. Circuit Judge Nathaniel Crawford arrived expecting a straightforward case of a captured hostile warrior facing charges of theft and assault. What he found instead was a packed courtroom, using that term loosely for the Prairie Bend meeting hall, filled with settlers, Cheyenne observers including Running Wolf and Tallgrass's family, Army representatives, and more observers than the small building could comfortably hold. The proceedings lasted 2 full days. Testimony was heard from Army scouts who had captured Tallgrass, from settlers who claimed losses from the raid in question, from witnesses who could provide context about treaty violations and broken promises that had led to the conflict. But the most powerful testimony came from unexpected sources. Emma and Billy testified about finding and helping Tallgrass, about the conversations they'd shared, about learning to see him as a person rather than an enemy. Their simple, honest accounts of showing compassion to someone suffering created a moral dimension to the proceedings that transcended legal technicalities. Dr. Hendricks testified that Emma's care had been medically sound and had saved the prisoner's life. He added that any system of justice that would punish children for showing mercy was fundamentally unjust, regardless of what laws might technically have been violated. Running Wolf testified about the conditions on the reservation, about promised supplies that never arrived, about children dying from hunger and disease, while government officials embezzled funds meant for their care. He didn't excuse his brother's actions, but provided context that made those actions understandable, if not legally defensible. Tallgrass himself testified, speaking through an interpreter, but with such dignity and honesty that even those predisposed against him found themselves listening. He acknowledged participating in the raid, explained it was driven by desperation to feed families starving on inadequate reservation rations, and accepted responsibility for his choices. But he also challenged the settlers and the court to acknowledge that the circumstances creating such desperation were not of the Cheyenne people's making. Judge Crawford, a man whose reputation for fairness was matched by his skill at finding pragmatic solutions to impossible problems, took a full day to consider all evidence before rendering his decision. When he finally spoke, his words would be quoted in newspapers across the territory and referenced in future legal proceedings dealing with similar situations. He acknowledged that Tallgrass had violated laws and should face consequences. However, he also stated that justice required considering context, that laws applied in vacuum created injustice rather than preventing it. He sentenced Tallgrass to time served plus 6 months of community service, to be completed by working with the Prairie Bend settlement on projects that would benefit both the settlers and local Cheyenne bands, building a school that could serve both communities' children, establishing a formal trading post that would facilitate peaceful economic exchange, creating infrastructure for the benefit of all. It was an unprecedented sentence, requiring oversight and cooperation from multiple parties who had been in conflict. Many criticized it as too lenient toward a criminal or too harsh toward someone fighting for his people's survival, depending on which side the critic favored. But Judge Crawford declared that if peace was ever to be achieved, it would come through finding creative ways for different peoples to live alongside each other, with mutual benefit rather than mutual destruction. The judge also addressed Emma and Billy directly, stating for the record that no charges would be filed against them, that their actions demonstrated the highest principles of compassion and moral courage, and that any community that punished such behavior was not worthy of the children it produced. As the trial concluded and decisions were implemented, life in Prairie Bend gradually returned to something resembling normalcy, though nothing was truly the same. The promised school building began construction, with workers from both communities contributing labor. The trading post became a reality, facilitating exchanges that benefited everyone and creating economic incentives for peaceful relations. Tallgrass, as part of his sentence, lived in Prairie Bend for the required 6 months, working alongside the settlers he had once fought against. His presence was initially tense and awkward, but over time familiarity bred, if not friendship, at least understanding. People learned names, shared stories, found common ground in the universal experiences of struggling to survive, raising children, hoping for better futures. Emma and Billy became something like ambassadors between communities, their unique position and the respect they'd earned from both groups allowing them to facilitate communication and understanding. They learned more Cheyenne language, taught English to Cheyenne children, and gradually helped build bridges that politics and law could not construct alone.